Hi everyone, and thanks for joining me on this Jumis Ensemble video. It's been a really exciting week. Rehearsals are back up and running with the Jumis Ensemble, and I've just yesterday been rehearsing some viola cello duets with our violist Henry, which we'll be performing in our concert in August, which will be online. The concert is the first of 4 concerts that we're going to be performing for you to launch our brand new project, Composers Collaboration Project, with the amazing Rhiannon Randle. We've been trying to get this off the ground for a long time, and we are so excited that this is going to happen very, very soon. The first stage of this collaboration will be 4 short pieces composed for each individual member of the ensemble. These pieces are designed to integrate into already interesting and intriguing programs that we've put together based around some piano quartets. But as well as piano quartets, the Jumis Ensemble likes to play other formations of chamber music and find interesting and hidden gems in the chamber music repertoire to add to those programs. So these first 4 pieces will be added to those. And then in the second part of this project, Rhiannon will be composing us a full piano quartet, which hopefully, if the funding happens, we'll be performing sometime in 2021. Earlier this week, I had the wonderful opportunity to sit down with Rhiannon and chat to her about the project and to get to know her a little bit. She's a long-time friend of 2 of our members, but I'd only met her a couple of times when we'd met to discuss the project. I hope you find this intriguing and interesting as I did, and a little inside look behind the scenes of what goes into a collaboration of this sorts, how Rhiannon as a composer works, and how we interact with each other, and how we'll be delving into this project. I'd like to welcome Rhiannon to this little chat here. It's really great that you could be with us.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful to be here. And I would start off quickly by saying how wonderful it is to be involved with, actively working with musicians during a time where, for a long while now, good few months, all of this kind of music making has had to be put very much on hold. So it's a real pleasure for me too.
Oh, fantastic. Just on that, we've mentioned it, we might as well sort of talk a little bit about it. I mean, I just want to ask how have things been for you personally during this tough period? I know that for us as players, it's been difficult not being able to rehearse together and play music and have concerts, but I'm sure for you, it's also had an impact on everything you're doing.
Yeah, well, a lot of what I do is sort of dividing my time up between teaching, composing, and I do play and sing as well. So obviously the active performance side of things has been decidedly not happening, as with the rest of the world, but a lot of the rest of it has been very much spending time alone. And it's funny because a lot of the cliches about composers are that composers are constantly alone, and a lot of the work is actually very lonely anyway, because it's you with your ideas and your material and your score and your proofreads. So in a sense, composing can happen anywhere at any time. It's not like that side of things has to stop, but I think the impact of the fact that so much live music and so much of that kind of flesh and blood of what we do as musicians has had to stop is definitely, I think it's definitely made an impact. I didn't write anything for a while, and I think that was kind of a point of, partly because I was doing quite a lot of teaching and needed to get my head around that, how to work Zoom, for example. I wouldn't say that it's affected me in the way that I know that it's affected a lot of people who are fundamentally relying on their performance all the time. But the fact that this music making has had to stop, it's definitely not been the best thing. Well, to say the least, it's not been the best thing, but I'm glad that things are slowly making their way back together now.
Yes, they are. I mean, it's super exciting now, and having had a few rehearsals myself now, sort of socially distanced rehearsals now, and getting back into programs, it's super nice to see that. So hopefully, fingers crossed, we'll keep going in the right direction. So just going back to this project, which I'd like to sort of talk to you a little bit about. Just the first thing, as I was saying earlier, about how we sort of looking at influences and of composers, either from themselves to other people, or the influences they've had. And I just thought it'd be interesting to get to know you a little bit. If you could tell us a little bit about sort of your life as a composer, your influences and music you like to write. I know from discovering some of your works myself that there seems to be quite a broad range of things, which is absolutely fantastic. And I'd encourage anyone to go out and listen to to your works, because they are really quite incredible. But yeah, to sort of tell us a little bit about you and your music.
Well, it's quite interesting at this point in time to talk about that, because I've just spent quite a lot of time over the past few years doing quite a lot with vocal music and choral music, which isn't necessarily a direction that I could have imagined myself going in, say, 10 years ago when I was at university, just starting out. At university, I was very much thinking that, well, I didn't know how big a role composition would play in my life at all. It's an idea that I'd had for a very long time. In fact, I basically started writing when I was about 8 or 9, using a little voice recorder just to multi-track myself, singing and playing the piano and things like that. And it's always been a part of what I've done. I've always wanted to copy styles and mimic things, and I have a whole bunch of stuff that's very sort of, kiddie pastiche stuff from when I was about 10, stored away in a folder somewhere. So I think it was always a huge part of my life, but the directions I've actually gone in subsequently, after really committing to it and saying, yeah, I'm going down this road, have been quite diverse. So I'm both a violinist and singer, and I think both of those are important branches to me, because being a performer and a composer, I think is quite important to think about when you're looking at somebody's work. If they are mostly just a composer, and they don't actively go out and perform, sometimes that can make a completely different type of music to when you're performing yourself. Partly because I think a lot of the projects that have come around for my instrumental side of things, I felt a personal connection to through either my instrument or through knowing the people who I've played music with in the past. And actually, this is very much the case with you guys. I have known 2 members of your ensemble for a long time. We actually met on a chamber music course about 10-15 years ago. Seems a long time now. And actually, it is important to me to maintain that connection with performance when I'm writing pieces. And I know that seems like quite a broad thing to say, and obviously music can't really exist without performance. Well, it can on a computer, it can in many other forms. But also for me, I think if I start talking more about figures or composers who have influenced me, in a way I would say the composers who've had the biggest impact on me have also been performer-composer style, even singer-songwriter style composers. So when I was a lot younger, I became particularly interested in the way that, well, I used to enjoy the music a lot of Shostakovich and Britten, and that sort of style of diatonic but sort of free diatonic 20th century music, which actually led me to Stravinsky and then neoclassicism, and then eventually I really sort of went down a bit of a French route and became really interested in spectral composers, sort of the 70s and 80s, like Tristan Murail and Gérard Griset, which wasn't a route I was necessarily planning to go down, because it very much heavily uses computers, and it uses basically a lot of scientific things. It uses taking sound and dissecting sound, what is sound, the natural harmonic series, things like that. So they were, those 2 things already are sort of incredibly diverse. But what I think is fascinating, going back to the performing thing, is actually that something that Benjamin Britten used to say is that he would write for the people behind the instrument, not the instrument itself, particularly in the case of writing for Rostropovich, which I think is very interesting, given that I'm currently writing a piece for cello and for you to play. And I remember when we first met as a group, all of us, and we were talking about this on Zoom, I remember saying that one of the things that interested me was to get to know you guys as performers as well, and subsequently I've gone and listened and watched and got more of a sense of that, which is really exciting. because I think it is true that the pieces that I write always have to have some connection to the person, or even if it's not necessarily the person, some connection to something that is beyond just the notes on the page. I think I'm very much one of those kind of extra musical influenced people, as well as, I mean, obviously the notes are incredibly important, but I think you've got to have a higher inspiration for something.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. I like that sort of the personal aspect of things, because I think that's one of the things that certainly as a group that we've discussed together about sort of how we don't seem to delve enough into the actual people that are the composers when we look at music. And I think, and the relationships that they had with the people around them, we tend to look at things very much from an analytical point of view, and we draw similarities based on style and the time periods they were in and the influences of and their cultures, etc. But we don't actually look necessarily at the impact that these things were having on them as people. So I think for us as musicians, I think one of the really interesting things for us to do is actually to start exploring that in a sort of more actively. And it's interesting to hear you talk about writing and actually actively thinking of the performers. So I think it's sort of an interesting new sort of look on things and how we could maybe come together a little bit. And I think one of the really exciting things about this project is that we are going to get to do that, and we're sort of working together, and really sort of, it's going to be a longer process where we'll play things and we'll get to know each other, and we'll have many times when we'll get in contact and sort of look at the music. And I think that's really exciting that we can actually do a project like that, which doesn't necessarily happen very often. So that's going to be really exciting.
Wonderful. I think it very much ties into the themes that you were talking about, you know, what are the influences of people, teachers, and influences from the network of people and performers around you. And that's actually one of your briefs that you sent me for your project. So it's nice that our conversation sort of ended up down that road already.
Which is fantastic. Just to take it more directly into the project, I was just, before we go into the specifics of this particular project, I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you as a composer start and sort of get into a project and your process of writing. And I was wondering, if it's just interesting for me to know if you have a very specific way of working, or do you sort of allow things to organically sort of take shape in your head and then put them down quite quickly? And just if you could tell us a little bit about that process for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually wondered at this point if it would be useful if we could have a look at some of the sketches that I'm making for the cello piece, because it may be a good plan for me to show one way that it unfolds. I mean, if that's something
that would be fun. That would be fantastic. Yeah, if you could, that would
Great.
be wonderful.
Well, what I can do then is I can do that clever thing where I share my screen.
Fantastic.
Wonderful. All right, so I'm starting off here with something that looks a little bit colourful. I will start, I'm going to sort of use the sketches that I've got for the current piece I'm working on, the cello piece, as a sort of a guide to talk about how one way of going about sketching a piece, and how I sort of put things together in a bit of a, I would say a bit of a holistic way, because I'm as I've mentioned already, I'm the sort of person who needs multiple dimensions of inspiration to really get me into a piece. So I think it will be useful to talk about a few of those different inspirations via the sketches I've got here. So this is a very basic plan. This is actually something that I constructed for all four of these short solo pieces. As you can see, because I've got cello, violin, viola, piano written here, what I've actually done is I've taken the 12 notes and I've split them up into 2 hexachords, so that's 6 notes, and because there are 4 pieces, each piece gets 3 notes. What I'm doing with this is not supposed to be really so constrictive like that. It's not going to just have 3 notes in it, but this is going to form a main motif for the piece. I'm not 100% decided yet how far down the sort of structural route I'll go with this yet, whether the motifs will appear multiple times, whether the motifs will become melodically or harmonically developed throughout the pieces, or whether there'll be more of a sort of something that I can hold on to while I'm going, because what's quite difficult to describe post the planning phase like this is how things actually unfold on the page. And one thing that I think is quite clever, which I quite like, which is a total accident, but the cello and the viola ones are actually the same motif, just transposed up a semitone. I really like that. And the violin and the piano one, I deliberately tried to keep the same shape. So I wanted to have some general sense of connection between them. And before I go on to the next stage of how do I go about sketching from here, I want to talk about the colours, because I've mentioned here there are some colours. I know that forest is not an ocean, not really colours, but these are sort of terms I'm using to try and describe the feel of the piece and the images that I have in my head when I'm writing them. This is particularly personal for me because I have what's known as synesthesia, which is basically where it's a sensory thing where I basically see colours in my mind's eye when I hear music. And that's been quite an interesting thing for me because I didn't realise that I had this until fairly recently. And it's not something that I'd really use much to kind of cultivate musical material or use in my pieces until I would say a couple of years ago when I wrote a piece for piano trio, which was done at the Dartington International Summer School. And it was a piece that was entirely based on the colour blue and multiple shades of the colour blue, but also how the colour blue can be seen as a sort of a poetic symbol. So the sky, the sea, but also technology and the blue screen of our computers and things like that. So I thought that that was quite an interesting way to go about it. So one of the first things that I thought about when thinking about the project's brief of people and their external influences, colour came to me very quickly, because for me it's both sort of a very personal thing in that basically nobody sees the same colours in the same way, and particularly this is true with synesthesia. A famous composer who had this was Messiaen, and he actually went as far as writing the colours that he saw in his mind's eye into the score, and he almost wanted the players to feel those colours how he did. But it's impossible to convey that really. It's more, and for me personally, I think it's just something I use in the back of my mind to help me just sort of, because I think different chords and different notes have different colours and it's completely involuntary. But when I thought about, you know, personal versus external, well, colours can be seen by people, they're seen in the world, but also the sort of meaning of them is quite personal for me. So that's why I colour coded them as I did. And the sort of I'm starting to get a vague sense with these two, I think, of sort of the greater sort of image in my head is going to be to do with a forest or an ocean. The reason I put terracotta here is because I was thinking particularly of the colour of the earth in the Mediterranean. That really kind of earthy, amazing kind of reddish ground, particularly in Spain, was really sort of on my mind for various reasons. I don't know why. Sometimes these things come up and I thought, you know, actually it's right, and with that set of notes it just makes me think of that colour. So that's enough of that for now. I'm going to move on to talking about how I then go about making a piece out of all of these very disparate elements. So time to share another screen, which is this one. Okay, so this again is a sort of a plan. This is specifically a bit of sketching that I've done for the cello piece. With this, you can see here that this is the terracotta motif, to give it a name. I kind of took that initially from the harmonic series based on C, which is what all of these four notes are based on, and actually to an extent that one as well. But what I was trying to do with this is, because I really love the resonance of the cello, particularly the C string. It's one of my favourite sounds, actually. I really love how, and you know, how deep and how rich you can make that C string sound. So I think the note C was always going to be a really big feature in this piece for me. And then using the harmonic series as well, because I really like, well, basically the lower you go, the more what we call partials or frequencies of the series you can get. So I think that was always going to be a big part of this for me. So here I basically started doing a little bit of motivic development from those opening three notes. Up here, what I've started to do is I've started to work out what the notes I haven't used yet are, so that I can possibly start to drip feed them as the piece goes on. But to be honest, that I tend to leave to musical intuition as I'm in the midst of the piece, because I know some composers really plan very strategically a lot of the different stages of the piece and a lot of the like pitch classes that they're using and things like that. But actually for me, I tend to leave that up to, yeah, as I say, kind of musical intuition, kind of feeling where the thing is going once you've got that opening kind of framework. So these are sort of some ideas and me just really playing around with that motif, and as I've said here, not this exactly, but an idea. So sort of messing around with that a bit and seeing what comes out of that is one really good sort of important way for me to start. And I think, because going back to the thing I was saying earlier about vocal music and how I've done quite a lot of that in recent years, I think melody has always been a really important material for me to use in my work. So I think I tend to go for developing melodies first when I'm sort of going through my process. So that's that. And then I've got something else which is actually seems completely unrelated, but again, this is just showing kind of how broad the inspirations can be. So another thing that I really am very passionate about is I really love traditional music from all over the world. It's a really big passion of mine. Any kind of folk music, I just love it. I've recently written a piece for viola and clarinet, which was based on folk tunes from the British Isles. And I say based on because sometimes there were actual quotations in the piece. Other times I was using the melody of the folk tunes as a kind of framework for the development of the structure in the piece. And what I've decided to do with this piece is that I basically had a tune in my head, which happens to be an Irish tune called The Kid on the Mountain. And this one is interesting to me because it's one thing that I really love actually about these kinds of melodies is that they circle around the same group of notes all the time, and they always come back to the same group of notes. And the repetition is actually really interesting to me because it's a very kind of succinct melodic development that circles around the same kind of group of notes, which then can provide some just interesting inspiration for motivic development. So what I've done here is written out the tune, but I've actually taken a slightly different approach here. I've decided to work out ways in which I could make that tune more lively and more interesting by working out what would happen if I basically made a rhythmic accelerando in the accents. This isn't something that I think will end up 100% in the piece, but what I think is interesting is that I took something very melodic, and I've all the way through our chat I've been talking mostly about melodic elements, but here I've started talking about rhythmic ones too, because when I've been working with folk tunes in the past, one thing that's really fascinated me as well, which I don't necessarily think plays a massive part in my music, but I would kind of like it to, is rhythm. And I've been working recently just in my pieces in general to try and get more of a grip on making rhythm a more interesting factor for just development of material. So this one I was just playing around with some accents there, but then I've also done, this is the last bit I'll show. This one is me just quite literally transcribing that tune, putting a couple of double stops in and things like that, just trying to work out from a more possibly harmonic basis how that tune would function. And I changed the original transposition of this tune to fit with that low C string, because one thing I love about these melodies, particularly the Irish ones, is that sometimes they're in modes that have flattened sevenths, and because the flattened seventh is one of the most striking features of the natural harmonic series, that tends to sort of find its way into my music anyway, whether I go through the kind of trad music route or through the harmonic series route. So here the low C string is the flattened seventh. So I think that's something that I'm sort of starting to tie together various like seemingly unrelated threads to kind of bring together for this piece. So as of yet, this is where I'm at. I'm sort of at the moment still at the stage where I've got these disparate ideas, and what will probably happen is I'll go into the next phase, which will be me slamming various things on the page, and this is the part where it gets really messy, and I almost can't talk about it as beautifully and as academically as I just have done, because that's a bit where it's like the artist just throwing paint at the canvas and seeing where it lands, because once you've chosen your tools, you kind of have to just do it. And a lot of that side of the process is really interesting to talk about after the event, but at the time I just tend to not really know what's happening. I just kind of go with it and sort of roll with the things that sound the best musically. And I think that's kind of the thing about composing, is that it's so much a balance of the sort of planning, structure, the kind of logical side of things, and the messy, the creative, throwing paint at a canvas, use that metaphor again.
No, I think that's really interesting. I mean, thank you so much for sharing those sketches. I mean, that's really, I mean, to be able to see them, I mean, it's one thing, I mean, you talk about them so beautifully, but actually to see them and actually see them like, physically is really interesting for me, and I'm sure for people who are watching. It's interesting though, the last bit you're talking about there, this idea of the sort of the throwing the paint on the canvas, this creative sort of process, I think is really interesting. And one that, again, like once it's over, you can sort of talk about more. But it's one that I relate to as a performer, I suppose, in terms of when it comes to interpreting music. That we do this kind of analysis at the beginning where we understand the structure and of the piece that we may be performing, and then at that point you kind of start rehearsing and playing, and actually things happen naturally, and things can be done in so many different ways. And I think it's wonderful to hear that when you're composing, there's a similar stage in which you've kind of you've created your boundaries, as it were, but then there is that phrase of like sort of this can go in so many different directions, which is really exciting. And just a lovely little thing, you're using Irish folk tunes, and I'm actually part Irish, so that's actually quite a wonderful coincidence that you didn't know about. But yeah, no, my father's side are from Dublin, so actually that's going to be really exciting little coincidence there.
Good. I like it when that happens.
That's another. Yeah, it's wonderful when those things happen. Just continuing on this a little bit, just a little bit more. Is this kind of academic process that you have? Is that something that is that where you've always composed, or is that have you developed that sort of over time? And do you now feel that you have a kind of, every time you come to compose, is it the same, or would that change depending on the brief or what you're tending to write?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because I think it's something that I'm still constantly very aware of, and I'm working at a lot. In fact, I've been working at it particularly recently with preparation for writing these pieces, because I think one thing that I noticed about my earlier works is that I didn't have so much of a coherent sort of process at all, and something that has really come through studying composition, because I didn't really focus on composition as a fundamental discipline until I got to master's level, where I did MPhil at Cambridge, and then I went to Guildhall. So that was to focus on opera predominantly, so hence the sort of vocal side of things. But when I was really focusing on composing and thinking about my process a lot, that's where a lot of this came from. And I would say that it does change with different pieces, and it particularly changes between writing pieces that are predominantly instrumental and pieces that have a singer in them or singers. Because I think when there are singers, when there's a text, I think my process is really quite different, because I tend to use the text as a very important structural device. And a lot of the inspiration, sort of extra musical inspiration, will come from what that text is trying to say.
Of course.
whether that's within the context of, for example, I've been now for 3 years in residency with a church choir in the middle of London, St Michael's Cornhill, and writing music regularly for their church services. So obviously there's a much bigger sort of context, and the whole sort of the idea of it being liturgical and fitting within the British choral tradition, that is basically not mine. I kind of have to fit into that world with my music. Whereas when I'm writing something where I've chosen the text, or when it doesn't have a text at all, I'd say that it's very much the context becomes my own to create. And then from there, the sort of the more pitch choosing side of things, and the how do I lay it out and how do I deal with this, that becomes quite different for each one, I'd say.
Interesting. Yeah. And just from my own interest, do you prefer to have, when you come to write something, do you prefer to have like sort of freedom to write what you want to write, or do you like to sometimes have a more specific project, sort of brief to be given something? It's like, it's always an interest to me what composers prefer. So I'd be interested to see what your preference is, or if you have one. You may not.
It's an interesting question, because it actually goes back to the very essence of what I was saying earlier about composition being a really careful balance between the sort of logical, structured side of it and the creative side and the sort of messy paint throwing side. Because I know that there are some composers who really do sort of value the idea of, let's go with this, let's do this, let's be free. But there's been a really strong didactic element, I think, throughout all of the great composers pretty much ever, but particularly spoken a lot about in the 20th century, when tonality was no longer the reigning thing. Is that how do you use the pitches? How do you order them? What's the hierarchy? Is there a hierarchy? What's the point of this? Are we using pitch at all? Are we using different materials? But I think particularly it brings me back to what Stravinsky said, which is that the more, to paraphrase, it's the more heavily I limit myself, the more creative freedoms I have. Because I believe you do have to have limitations in order to be able to create anything. So from my perspective, I really like having briefs, because I like to see how my own personal ideas can fit within that framework. They're in a kind of a very extra musical way, or in a very specific note-based way. And I think for me, it's kind of, I go to both extremes. It's kind of the bigger picture and the detail that I will put limits on. Partly because I think if there are no limits, or certainly if you have to set your own limits, I think that it still is a very important thing to bear in mind, that the limits have to be set at some stage. Otherwise, it's a completely free-for-all, and it won't create the best music. None of the best pieces have ever been created from just, okay, you have 12 notes, or possibly if you're using microtones, you have 24 plus. Go for it. Nobody's ever created a really, really good piece of music from that. So I think it's interesting also how the development of music from the 20th century onwards was so heavily based on how to limit all of this material, given that we no longer have to deal with perfect cadences so much, unless we want to. So I think it's good.
Great. And just one quick, if you were to give one piece of advice to somebody who's composing, or who's sort of struggling in that starting process, because I'm sure I'm not sure, I assume that once you have something there, that sometimes, and you've started, ideas can then flow from that. And yes, you may end up on a completely different tangent, but at least you're on a road somewhere. But that initial, I think for me, what seems to would be the hardest point for me was, even if I have something, that kick-starting, just getting something, that initial idea down. Is there anything you do or would advise anyone to do if they're struggling to get that to that point or into the piece?
Yeah, well, I think it's different for everyone, and in a way it sort of chimes with what people's interests are, because a lot of composers have particular go-tos that they use just to make some basic material. So a lot of people have talked quite a lot about using things like matrices, so basically pitch matrix kind of grids and things like that, basically taking the 12 notes and just going, right, okay, here we go. And it's a little bit like what I did with my motif plan that I showed you earlier, is that I took 12 notes and I went, okay, well, 4 times 3 is 12, 3 notes per piece. Now I'm going to just, find, a way of getting around this. I mean, that is one way of going about it. I mean, other people might choose to do that, but say, for example, with chords instead. And I think I've chosen to focus on pitches this time, partly because I think, out of all of the instruments, I mean, the piano is the one that is going to be the most chordally based. I'm not saying that the other 3 can't play chords. It's just not something that I think is going to be 100%. Well, I'm not going to be in everyone's good books if I just write completely chordal pieces for violin, viola, cello. Obviously, chords are not just used as chords. Chords are used split. They're used as framework. They're used as ideas. And some people's minds think more like that, whereas I'm the kind of person who thinks more melodically. So I think, as a tip, I would say to the composer if the composer was struggling, I would say, what is it that really draws you to music? Is it melody, harmony, rhythm? What is it? And basically focus on that one thing first. Create something out of just that one idea. And in fact, because I teach composition at Junior Guildhall, and I run workshops for composers on Saturdays, usually during term time. And a lot of them come to me with this question. And I've actually run a series of workshops with them just focusing on rhythm, then focusing on melody, then focusing on harmony, focusing on timbre and texture. And I've said to them, can you create a piece using just these things? And they've all managed it. And it goes to show that if you just focus in on one area, then the other areas can feed into those areas. So yeah, I think it's important not to feel overwhelmed by all of the possibilities too quickly, because I think that tends to be what happens at the beginning of a piece, speaking from experience.
Great. So just lastly, before we wrap things up, I'm excited to ask you a little bit about the overall project, because I know that we've looked at the cello piece specifically, and that's the first one that's going to be played. We're going to do a concert in August that's going to be online, but there's obviously the individual pieces for everybody else in the group, and then hopefully we'll manage and we'll get through and we'll do the piano quartet at the end. And I just wonder if that's something that is already in your mind, is when you get a brief that's got lots of different parts to it, do you plan something overall? Do you have any overarching ideas, or is it something that you'll just let unravel, and how do you deal with that kind of a brief?
It's interesting. I'd say a bit of both, a bit of pre-planning, a bit of unrolling. But also I think it's interesting to have a project like this, and I'm actually very grateful for it, because I really like the idea of something building on something else and really kind of getting that sort of gradual sense of almost like you've got different puzzle pieces and you're putting it all together. In a way, that's sort of almost a metaphor for the composing itself. But I like the idea that the people and external influences umbrella theme that you've been talking about is very much on my mind. And what I would like to do, I think, is sort of going back to the initial plan, is we'll see how this unfolds with the motifs, whether or not I end up thinking, no, actually I'm not going to use those, or if they become not that important to the pieces or whatever. But if I were to find a way to go back to that first plan and essentially put together all of the, basically all 12 of those notes in the way that I'd organised them, and sort of have all of the motifs from all of the little pieces coming together into the larger ensemble work, I think that would certainly provide a useful sort of thread for me to think about at this stage. But sort of thematically speaking, I'm thinking it's probably going to be something quite colourful, given that colours have been quite an important part of this, scenery has been quite an important part of this. folk tunes have been an important part of this. There's going to be some overarching way of bringing these together, which I think is the part that will unfold during the process of writing the 4 short ones. Yeah.
Wonderful. I was just on that tangent, talking about that sort of colours and themes and things that bring things together, and I was thinking actually the other day with some other colleagues about this idea of connecting with people. And when you hear music, you obviously want to make people feel something and connect with them on a personal level. And as performers, we're always trying to make sure that we are serving what the composer has written, but also attaching a personal part to that, and then letting the audience accept that in their way, and that can be a really tricky path to follow, and I wondered if that was something that you're very aware of during the process, and how specific do you want your ideas to come across, in terms of like these. So we've talked about the colours and the scenes that you sort of talked about in your sketches, and are they like necessarily going to? Do you really want those to come across as specific things, or do you expect people to interpret them differently? And how do you go about forming those ideas with that in mind? Sorry, that's a very weirdly worded question.
No, it's great. I really see what you're getting at here, because this is a big question that comes up quite a lot. How specific is specific? And I think I would say quickly as well, similar to what I said earlier about the synesthesia thing, that for me is very much a personal thing that I could never imagine that anybody would necessarily see that colour if they hear this piece. I want them to hear something and feel something. What that is, that's going to be personal to them, I feel. So that sort of thing, and a lot of the planning stages that I've shown you so far, a lot of that is really for my benefit rather than necessarily the music's benefit. Because I think when a piece comes out, it needs to basically feel coherent. And what I feel that the most effective pieces in general come out where you don't actually want to question the process behind it, and you don't necessarily want to say, okay, well, actually, did the composer necessarily stick to the original plan? But actually, it can be really useful to go in and analyze it to that extent. But when you're listening to it or when you're performing it, I think it's important that you're not always so wrapped up in the sort of the nitty-gritty. In terms of being specific, though, and in terms of the composer-performer dialogue, it's essentially very much collaborative, particularly with a project like this, where we are going back and forth and we're sharing ideas, and I'm working with you as much as you're working with me. I think that I've always felt it's quite important for me to notate things as clearly as possible on the score. But to that, it's really hard to describe what I mean by that, really. But I think what the point is that if I've written something that's unclear and then kind of takes a while to unpick, that can sort of waste a bit of rehearsal time and things like that. But what I don't mind at all is when I've written something and somebody says, but wouldn't it sound nicer, better, more interesting this way? And then they provide maybe a different articulation, a different dynamic. That's what I love about this kind of collaborative process of working with performers, is that they can provide other ideas. I think, though, fundamentally it's my job to notate things as clearly as possible and to make that sort of initial idea clear, even if it then ends up changing. Or even if it's one of those things where the performer really feels it differently to how I've written it, at which point it's either a case that, we go back to the drawing board and we think, do I actually want to change that tempo, or am I going to just let the performer do it that tempo for this performance? This is a continuous thing, and I feel like there's never actually an end to that process, particularly if the piece gets done more than once, more than by the commissioned group, more than by just the premiere. The more that a piece gets life, obviously the more interpretations will come into it, to the point where it's no longer really the composer's piece. I mean, in a sense, me thinking about my work as an opera composer, an opera is never it's never one person's piece. It's so many people's piece, and it's incredible going inside an opera company and seeing just how many different views there are on something. And even then, you know, in the second production, it would be different again, even if the notes on the page stay the same. So I think that's very much the opinion I take to this, is that I'll try to notate my ideas as clearly as I can, but then also I'm very open to the idea that performers will bring something to it, and I really encourage that. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think we as a group, and I certainly myself, are so excited to actually get involved in that process with you, from what you've been talking about today, and also from your other music, and knowing from our point of view that we're constantly working always on music that we can't talk to the composer, and we wish that we could have these conversations with them and find those sort of lines where we can bounce off each other. So it's really exciting that we're going to be doing that. And I want to say a huge thank you again for joining me this afternoon to talk about this, and I can't wait to get started. What I will say, add just to the viewers at home, is that these projects they don't happen on their own, and we are extremely grateful to the Ralph Vaughan Williams Trust, who have given their financial support to this project. And we also have a GoFundMe page, which will be in the description above if you're on Facebook, below on YouTube, which I'll put there as well. I'll put also Rhiannon's website there, so you can go and find out more about her and listen to some of her music. And there'll be links to the ensemble website as well. Thank you, Rhiannon. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Toby. It's been wonderful. I'm really excited.
Really excited. Great, fantastic. And see you very soon.